All right, hi everybody. My name is Courtney Savi Lawrence. I'm with the Regional Innovation Team of UNDP Asia Pacific, and we are really excited to have what we're calling Edge Session. So we're leading up to our Community of Practice week, kicking off next week specifically, and we wanted to be able to showcase a few different perspectives, and especially this week we're focused on those coming from Southeast Asia with a little bit of different perspective. Specifically today we have Carl Hapal, who is working and has been working out of the Philippines for several years and also teaching at the University of the Philippines. But today he'll walk us through some of the alternative points of view, different practices, even alternative regionalism. And this is building on a body of work that him and several colleagues from around the region have been crafting over time. So we wanted to hear a little bit more about what that looks like, what are the opportunities and takeaways possibly for us as those working in intermediary organizations or just literally in the field from policy to practice. What kinds of things might we want to be considering in learning from communities on the ground? So Carl, really grateful for you to take an hour out of your busy schedule to be with us. We know you're teaching many classes and convening several networks. So with that being said, thanks once more, and over to you. Looking forward to hearing your perspective. Cheers.
Okay, thank you, Courtney. Greetings to everyone who's joining us for this webinar. My name is Carl Hapal, and I'm talking to you from my room here in the Philippines, Quezon City, Philippines. I used a virtual background because my room is messy. And as you can see, my hair has grown long. I've been 6 months without a haircut because of the continuing quarantine restrictions here in the Philippines. Other countries are better off. And so I'm here to present our experiences with alternative practices. The title of my presentation is Alternative Practices in Southeast Asia, Sharing Narratives, Building Connections, Reinforcing Solidarity Amid Diversity. Now, so that you would know more or less where I'm coming from, let me just tell you that as Courtney said, I'm teaching at the University of the Philippines. My particular college is called College of Social Work and Community Development. I teach at the Department of Community Development, where our pedagogy is centered on immersing ourselves amidst poverty and the life of poor people here in the Philippines. And so, as you can see in the picture, below are some of my students, and on the top portion, you will see our partners in the community. Our students spend at least a year in various communities all over the Philippines, and we as faculty provide supervision. So it's called the Field Instruction Program. And so our work with grassroots communities is very much ingrained in the college, and it is no wonder, I think, that I managed to get into a program within the university-based think tank called Center for Integrative and Development Studies, where one of the program is called Program on Alternative Development. Now, the Program on Alternative Development, or AltDev, as we would like to call it, basically aims to look at paradigms, policies, practices, and projects that are largely marginalized and excluded from the mainstream. So this would include practices by people's organization, self-help groups, and other non-mainstream actors in society. And we think that these practices, in so many ways, challenge the dominant models of development. Nonetheless, they do not figure prominently in the national and international discourse. So there's a need, in our view, to put them in the spotlight and put them on equal footing amid the dominant discourses. in order to offer alternatives to the existing system. So my presentation is in many ways born out of our experience being immersed, documenting, studying, commiserating, and celebrating with different grassroots organizations in the Philippines and the rest of Southeast Asia, which includes also Timor-Leste. What I will share is the result of an incipient project towards achieving alternative development and perhaps an alternative model of regionalism in the Southeast Asia region. It is an initiative which we launched in 2017. However, I will not be presenting a model for alternative development. Um, as you can see, we just began with our work. Instead, I would like to focus on how we attempted to go about the process of understanding what is alternative development and alternative regionalism together with our grassroots partners. And perhaps outline what were the lessons that we've learned and how do we move forward from there. So, but before I begin my presentation, let me preface my presentation by sharing to you what I think is one of development's often neglected problems. Development is often understood as a process towards the amelioration of life, a life that is dignified and meaningful. Yet, as many of you already know, by experience or otherwise, there are many ways to go about this end. And we have no shortage of theories and interventions, all of which draw from an interpretation of the world and the means to change it. However, it is in the process of interpretation and intervention where the problem lies. To be more precise, the problem lies with the one doing the interpretation and the one intervening. As development projects are undertaken, it seeks to change the world for the better, a novel and altruistic aspiration, but it often does so with populations and cohorts in mind. There is nothing inherently wrong with this, and we've been doing this for the longest time. And it has thinking through cohorts and populations and affecting entire populations and um, putting them out of poverty has taken great leaps and strides in the past few years, no, past few decades. There is nothing wrong inherent with this except for the tendency to flatten the human experience, their condition their condition into something palatable and manageable, especially for the managers of development. And so life with all its complexity, mundaneness, joy, triumph, pain, and suffering is muted and translated into targets. And so the march towards development continues. Um, I'll go back to this point later on. Now, let me begin my presentation by um, populating my presentation with our partners and putting human faces in what we call alternative development. Offhand, please forgive me. I could have elaborated more on these experiences, but I had to limit the discussion due to time considerations. Okay. So in the picture is Pastor Benny. Pastor Benny comes from the indigenous tribe called Aitamag-Indi. What you are seeing in the picture is their ancestral domain. He once challenged us, if we were able to walk throughout their lands in one day, he will give us 1 hectare each. So here's another picture of their ancestral domain. When we met Pastor Benny, their tribe faced two main issues. So first, the preservation of their indigenous knowledge, systems, and practices. Second, the encroachment of corporations in their ancestral domain for mining or tourism. So Pastor Benny and his tribe is also no stranger to military harassment. They are often accused by the military for colluding with so-called communist insurgents. Okay. Now, let's go to Sorapon. So like Pastor Benny, Surapon is deeply acquainted with state coercion. Surapon is a farmer activist in Thailand, and he shared that corporations have encroached their lands, converting what were once rice paddies and forests into huge palm oil plantations. So Surapon and his comrades resisted and even negotiated with the government. However, they were sued for invading private property. So some of his comrades now wear tracking devices attached to their ankles, as you can see in the picture. Um, Now their farming community is literally surrounded and cut off by the palm oil plantations. Nonetheless, they remain steadfast in fighting for their way of life. Surapon said to us, even if they die, their ideology and way of life will live forever. Now, let's go to Abby and Mila. So let's focus on Abby. So unlike Sorapon and his community who were surrounded and cut off by palm oil plantations, thanks in large part due to the state, it was Abby and Mila's own state who threw them out of the city center and into far-flung relocation sites. So these relocation sites were part of the Philippine government's urban renewal efforts, which largely relied on removing the urban poor from informal settlements. So once relocated, Abby and Mila and their families had to endure destitute conditions. There was no electricity, there was no running water, there was no access to transportation, there were no jobs, and they were virtually left on their own. So despite these hardships, Abby and Mila, together with other women in their relocation site, organized and launched their own sewing business. The sewing business did more than provide employment to some women. It was also key in conscientizing them in various issues like violence against women and community development. Now, the guy in the picture, his name is Sastro. So like Abby and Mila, Sastro is also engaged in a social enterprise. His organization, Konfederasi Pergerakan Rakyat Indonesia, or KPRI, is engaged in sourcing organic coffee from local producers. And they sell it in Jakarta, which also serves as their coffee shop. So this is their coffee shop. And the coffee shop, however, is more than an outlet for locally sourced coffee. You see, KPRI is an umbrella organization. It also serves, so their office serves as a hub for various sectors under the KPRI network, which includes indigenous peoples, fisher folk, labor unions, urban poor, women, and the youth. So the office and their coffee shop, by extension, serves as a meeting place where they could hold critical discussions on Indonesian society. So what is interesting about Sastro and KPRI is their concept of transformative social protection, which relies not only in the sharpening of one's political ideology, but also securing and sustaining the means to sustain the struggle. So that is why the coffee shop is so important to them. The coffee shop symbolizes their political and economic project. Now, in AltDev, we believe that Southeast Asian peoples and communities have for many years and on their own been engaged in alternative, heterodox, and non-mainstream practices that encompass economic, political, and socio-cultural projects. And in some instances, people-to-people relations and networks for various purposes have also been set up. And part of our work in AltDev is finding them and documenting their practices. And more importantly, part of our work also is finding ways on how to make these otherwise isolated practices all over Southeast Asia and finding ways to connect them. So beginning in 2018, we spent parsing through our networks, looking for grassroots organizations and building connections and relationships with them. So in conjunction with the building of these networks, we did 2 regional conferences. So we invited grassroots development practitioners from Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Timor-Leste, Indonesia, Laos, Myanmar, and the Philippines. So the conference was a platform to share their experiences and find commonalities amid diverse contexts. So we would have done another conference this year, perhaps this November, supposedly. Sadly, COVID-19 happened. And in each of these conferences, there was a growing clamor to go beyond the conference format and instead go to their communities and see, feel, and experience their issues and initiatives. So we did exactly that. And in July 2019, we launched the first people-to-people exchange, or so that's how we call it, people-to-people exchange. So perhaps you cannot see in the picture, but here is Pastor Benny. Ayan. Pastor Benny, Surapon, Abby, Mila were among the participants. There were also other participants from Indonesia, Thailand, Laos, and the Philippines. So here's Sastro, here's Pastor Benny. Others are maybe, here's Mila. Yeah. Yeah. So Sastro, this guy, served as the co-host, and we initially stayed in Jakarta, but we immediately went to Chigolantang, Tasikmalaya, West Java, where we were hosted by Erni's organization, Serikat Pitani Pasundan, or Sundanese Peasant Union. So for 3 days, we stayed with SPP, where they showed us the fruits of people-led, multi-sectoral, and collective action. So here are some photos of the people-to-people exchange. Yeah. This guy, his name is Augustiana. He serves as the leader of SPP. And he told us about their struggle for agrarian reform. So they encountered many challenges, including kidnapping, killings, and incarceration. But they believed that they had to reclaim their land nonetheless. And for this, they must fight with the military, police, bureaucrats, and companies. So they were assaulted at all fronts. So in the end, people were able to overcome these challenges and successfully reclaim their land. But this came at a cost. More than 241 members were arrested recently. Most were student activists. In response, they organized advocacy campaigns and provided legal aid to them. And just in 2018, they have lost 2 members, and they were shot by the police. Yeah. This is Erni, one of the leaders also of SPP. So in any case, Ernie is proud that their land in Chigolontang has been, at least for now, secured and maintained by their people. So with their land secured, they have built schools. Yeah, so that's some of their students. So they built schools, recreational facilities, and they even plan on building their own people's college. So they did all of this from the contributions of their members. Ernie and Augustiana was adamant about not taking money from external donors, as this often leads to conflicts in terms of agenda between what people want and what the donor demands. So in the sharing, as I told you, other participants from Southeast Asia were also present. The sharing did not end with Ernie and SPP. Pastor Benny, Surapon, Abby, and Mila were also able to share their plight and initiatives at their community. And we were also joined by other partners, such as Bampen. So Bampen is also a farmer activist from Thailand. Bampen and her organization aim to tackle environmental issues as well as preserve the indigenous rice varieties, which has since been endangered as a result of the industrialization of rice production in Thailand. And we also have Alicia. a member of another indigenous tribe in the Philippines, their local health practices and community-based insurance system have, were crucial in providing emergency health care, especially in the absence of state services. Now, the Philippine state is making its presence felt in Alicia's community, not through health services, but with a dam project which will encroach on Alicia's ancestral lands. We were also joined by Maria Loretha, whose initiatives in planting sorghum has helped the issue of food security in Flores Island in Indonesia. And Sastro and KPRI was very interested with Maria Loretha sorghum that they agreed to explore how they could bring the product to Jakarta so that Maria Loretha would be able to access a bigger market. But they plan to do that on this 2020, but of course, the pandemic happened, so their plans continue to be on hold. And so this is sorghum. And so we were supposed to have another P2P this year, and it didn't push through again because of our current health crisis. And so why am I sharing this to you? And what is the relevance of sharing these experiences? And how is it related to alternative development or to alternative models of regionalism? So let me share a point or several points. So one, sharing the people-to-people exchange is a reiteration of the importance of experiences, histories of struggle, and victories and narratives. The people-to-people exchange, together with our other activities, such as our conference, is a symbolic act of affirmation that their stories do matter, and they do not become flattened in the wider march towards development. So that is, they are not mere cohorts or part of a population to be sub-objects of development. And by providing platforms where they can share, we are affirming the epistemic legitimacy of their experiences born out of and embedded within an unequal and inequitable society. Sorry for, I'm stuttering. Yeah. So the brief cases of Pastor Benny, Surapon, Abby, Mila, Augustiana, Erni, Bampen, Alicia, Maria Loretha, and our other partners also demonstrate that there are cross-cutting issues faced by the peoples of Southeast Asia. There is a continuing coercion of the state that is partly born out of its attempt to steamroll development, regardless of its consequences, especially against poor people. ASEAN member states has ostensibly put profit over people, despite of proclamations of pushing for people-centered development. We also see encroachment of large corporations, not only in land, but also in people's culture, heritage, and way of life. And there's also the resulting marginalization of entire peoples and growing inequality between the rich and the poor, the debasement of the environment, etc. All of this in the name of so-called development. In our minds, this development, mainstream development, is in many ways morally obtuse and unsustainable. And a reimagining of development or an alternative development is in many ways necessary. And so the question is, where should we begin this reimagining? As my brief sharing of experience has demonstrated, grassroots actors have immense productive capacities and power, despite of various challenges and limitations. It is a power that is not only limited to resistance, but also in creating systems, mechanisms, and practices that respond to their issues, whether local or national in scope. It is therefore this productive practice that we hope to harness and draw from in promoting alternative development. And as you can see, this version of alternative development assumes a rather inductive and iterative motion, bottom-up and grassroots or people-led. And this is quite different from what others may refer to people-centered or grassroots-centered, as the agents of development continues to be an external agent, albeit centered on poor people's interests. So you might ask, what is alternative development then? And perhaps this is the wrong question to ask. Um, this is the wrong question to ask. To ask for what is to ask for a definition. And to ask for a definition of alternative development is to ask for a definite model, a counterpoint to its mainstream counterpart. And I think, or we contend that alternative development is not defined by any model or a coherent amalgamation of theories, concepts, and prescriptions. Rather, alternative development is born out of practice. It is formulated by people, whether through contention or consensus. Alternative development, therefore, is a platform where, where a plurality of politics can coexist, countering or agreeing, but nonetheless interrelated. Yet, amidst the unequal society, we contend that this platform should retain its bias in privileging the epistemic fields of those who have been neglected, ignored, or rolled over by development. So the criticality of alternative development relies not only solely on its contrapuntal position against modern development. It is dependent on the capillary and productive power of its practitioners. So by building connections, solidarity, bettering practices, and creating bases of unity for a better future. Yeah. And this is the reason why we have privileged grassroots practices and exchanges between them. Uh, and it is the reason why we put so much emphasis in the exchange of stories, experiences, and narratives. We believe that it is through the exploration of these practices and their interaction that we hope to amass alternative practitioners, where each of one could talk, converse, and collectively explore a better way forward. Yeah. So, in many ways, our conception of alternative development is processual in nature rather than providing a particular model, no. And but I must reiterate that at this point, uh, this process has just begun, and 2 years is not really enough, and we've been hit by the pandemic, so most of our work have been suspended. And so I come to you not having a tidal wave of alternative practices or alternative practitioners ready to take over the world. Nor are we certain whether we want this tidal wave in the first place. Instead, what we have are streams of intersecting practices and conversations on alternative models of development. And this has been ongoing, at least virtually for now. So in the future, we hope that these streams and practices, we hope that these streams of practices and conversations would coalesce into a people-led regional movement. But we are still far away from that. And so our task right now is to widen the network, widen the platform for conversation, for sharing stories, widen our reach, and look for grassroots alternative practices. And in many ways, yun nga, the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted this process, and traveling to and from states in the ASEAN region is limited, and not all of our partners have access to the internet. We were not able to do what we had planned with our partners, and as I mentioned a while ago, even the plans of some of our partners amongst themselves weren't able to push through. So in the meantime, for this year, we shifted our focus doc, uh, on documentation and building connection in order to raise funds in order to provide some assistance to our partners. So that's the main line of work right now, is to raise funds, and documenting their practices, and continue with network building. So nonetheless, we maintained our connections with our existing partners. And we did this primarily through what we call kamustahan. So the kamustahan is a Filipino word. Kamustahan is a Filipino word, and it comes from the word kamusta. It is a form of greeting and roughly translates to hello. So when I say kamusta, I'm saying to you hello. But in Filipino language, kamustahan is more than a greeting. So it is a symbolic act of expressing empathy. So we periodically did kamustahan with our partners beginning in March, in order just to check on them, how they are doing amid the pandemic. And it is astounding that despite all the restrictions and challenges brought by COVID-19, their productive power and capacities were very apparent. And let me mention a few cases, no? So for example, Abby's organization, Igting or Maigting na Samahan sa Panlipunang Negosyante. So it's a social enterprise of women. Their organization has become a saving grace for the women, because their sewing business were able to provide income to the women. And they earn basically through sewing masks and PPEs at the moment. And more than producing for their income, they've also donated these protective equipment in their community. So many of the masks were donated to a community health watch, a local community health watch, which has been doing the distribution of masks and as well as relief operations, although very limited. So the Community Health Watch, which is a partner of, which is also our partner and Igting's partner as well, has been also doing education sessions in the community, of course with social distancing measures enforced, to raise awareness and educate the people on how to suppress the spread of the virus. And so far, I think they are doing quite well. They've unlike Metro Manila, who remains to be the hotspot of COVID-19 in the Philippines, their community has relatively low cases. Another partner that we have been in contact with is the Lumad School, and the Lumad School, or the Bakwit School. So Bakwit um, is a play with words. Bakwit is a shortened word for evacuate. So evacuate, they shortened the word evacuate because it has been ingrained in their practice, because they've been subjected to military harassment and armed conflict. So these people have been evacuating for the longest time. They've been known as the Bakwit people. So one of them is the Lumads, and they have their own indigenous schools, local schools, and since 2000, in recent years, the Lumad School has been targeted by a rising number of military operations, forcing the closure of many of their schools and causing the evacuation, so Bakwit, of 40,000 Lumad School children. So the Bakwit School was thus created as a makeshift mobile learning environment, some of which came to Metro Manila, and they are currently they are in the University of the Philippines. Now, despite of the heightened tensions and twin trepidations of the COVID-19 pandemic and military harassment, the Bakwit School have managed to continue with their learning programs and assert the Lumad's fundamental right to education. So dialogues with relevant government agencies and other organizations, as well as protest actions, have been conducted. So in the meantime, we were also trying to raise awareness about grassroots practices amid the pandemic. So recently, we launched a Facebook page and a YouTube channel named Lawan. Lawan, we were told by our friends from KPRI, is a Bahasa word which means to fight. And Lawan in general provides a platform for showcasing grassroots initiatives from various communities in the region. So we aim to highlight cases of solidarity, of forms of resistance against mainstream development. So far, we have featured 2 cases. And by October, we will feature cases from Thailand, Myanmar, and Burma. And you might find it interesting because these cases are presented in such a way that is they were presented in such a way that or sorry, it was produced in such a way that the grassroots community themselves were the ones directing and writing the script, and so we only did the editing of the video, and of course there are also other content such as infographics if you're interested, and so um, that is where we stand right now. We begin with people's narratives. We begin with people's stories and people's experience, their histories, and we do not flatten the human experience into populations and cohorts. It is an our work in AltDev is in many ways an affirmation of their epistemic legitimacy, and by affirming this epistemic legitimacy, their knowledge as valid, as legitimate, that we believe that is the one way in order to challenge the dominant discourse of development. And so I think that I will end there, and perhaps I can share more through the question and answer. So thank you. Another photo of Pastor Benny's ancestral domain. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carl. It's amazing, really, to hear the storytelling that you share. Literally, that you're advocating for, really, bringing to life, if not holding the integrity of the narrative and stories of everyone. But you did it in such an eloquent way as well, to walk us through so many different, components of people's lives and stories in the groups, from Pastor Benny to the social enterprise, by the women, for example. So where to even begin? Well, we do have some questions coming in, but I'll be keeping my moderator hat on, and actually, if you don't mind, asking one of the first ones, which is, one is acknowledging what you were sharing with us, which is that the intent is not to overprescribe, is to hold that space of complexity, from what I understand, as an entity in a decentralized way. So you're really, in a way, a facilitator of many different conversations happening. And then at the moment, it sounds like the placeholder of how you might be calling that, or the terminology, is around AltDev. So it's as you said, like a work in progress in many ways. I really appreciated how you opened with some of the thought around development in and of itself, right? So you're speaking, of course, for an audience that is, development oriented, and there's no shortage of theories and philosophies, approaches, and then you counter that by saying, okay, actually, there's sometimes the problems with development is actually with the interpretation, and who is doing the interpreting and who is doing the intervening. So that provocation in and of itself is quite powerful straight away, right off the bat. One of the questions I have for you, as Southeast Asia especially, you could argue that, especially because of COVID, we're at a development crossroads globally, all over the world. Everything is being, let's say, we have to reconfront, paradigms, structures, policies, systems. And so from that point of view, one question that I would have for you is where do you see this type of work, having impact in the sense of possibly being part of the reconstruction effort of where things need to go in terms of recalibrating for the environment, for the economy. As you mentioned, you've highlighting all of these different cases where communities are building solutions for their own context, and therefore even more relevant in that sense. But you also noted, ASEAN as a model, as a regional economic development model, it actually favors economic gains, sometimes at the cost, right, of human ecosystems or human, like, communities, for example. So where do you see this going, in the sense that we are noticing different types of policy options being slowly but surely more and more open to thinking of the inclusivity of all actors, including grassroots actors as we're describing them here? But where do you see this going? Of course, you mentioned COVID has put a pause on convening in the ways that you were kind of planning for it. But from a policy perspective, where UNDP is often playing somewhat of a role, how do you see that actually working in a way that does justice to the intent of the narratives and the perspectives that you're bringing to the table? Sorry, that was a bit long-winded. Yeah. Apologies to all, really. Doing a mini recap, but also asking a few different questions at the same time in there for you.
Yeah. Let me just share, because I had this discussion in one of my class, and we were discussing about the neoliberal debate versus Keynesian economics, and the central debate was in society, which actor is the main agent of development. And so in this age of COVID, in this time of pandemic, we see states that do not have the fiscal capacity in order to stimulate the economy, in as much as, like, for example, the New Deal of Roosevelt in the 1940s, in order for the US to move out of the Great Depression. So, for example, in the Philippines, it has taken a lot of debt in a span of a very short time, and the government is already drumbeating that taxes will be raised, additional taxes will be raised pretty soon. And so in that case, in one sense, you have people questioning the ability of the state in order to promote development, in many ways, because it has been crippled by the pandemic, and their flaws has been exposed by the virus. And on the other hand, you have the market, who's virtually at the standstill. And you see, economic growth in a neoliberal system would require people not stopping to be productive, or companies continuing to chug along despite of all the restrictions. And on the other hand, at least from our vantage point here at AltDev, we see various formations of community-based organizations who have gone to support or provide amelioration, provide support, and provide assistance to their neighbors in their community. Although it is very limited, no. And so for example, here in the Philippines, the Philippine government would say, let's promote a whole of government approach. And to that, we say that maybe we should rethink the way we approach this crisis. Maybe we should, instead of pushing for a whole of government approach, maybe we should promote a whole of society approach, where you give us the platforms and you give us opportunities to help, because people are able to. And as I mentioned a while ago, they have productive capacities, not only in terms of resistance, no, but also in providing creating mechanisms. So that's also a very long answer. So in a sense, what I'm trying to say is that perhaps instead of in this time of COVID, instead of seeing purely as the issue of seeing it as an economic issue, as a health issue, as a governance issue. Maybe it's also an issue of how do you bring in more people in order to collectively solve this problem.
And by the way, so what does that look like? I mean, if there was the magic wand, so to speak, I hear your point, and it's really about reframing the perception, almost the capabilities that everyday people actually already have and hold and bring to the table. From an institutional or structural vantage point, what does that look like from the work that or the conversations you're having with your teams and your classes, by the way?
Yeah. So let me just backtrack with the social enterprises of women. And there's been a lot of controversy with this whole protective equipment in terms of the mask and the suit itself. And at the outbreak of the pandemic, the government was importing um, uh, these products. No? Instead of harnessing community-based producers and other social enterprises, which um, which they did very recently, but I think it's already too late. Well, it's a good thing that the government has reached out to some of these social enterprises. No? And I think that's one concrete example where you could uh, harness the productive capacity of some community-based organizations. And for example, another I was mentioning about the Community Health Watch a while ago, and I'm sorry if I'm only speaking about the Philippines. Our research with other partners is not yet still complete. So please bear with me. So the Community Health Watch, I was saying, the government was adamant, stay at home, stay at home, stay at home. But they fail to recognize, at least in that community, that there's a network of health advocates that are able to or have the existing infrastructure in order to disseminate the information more effectively than them. And in that case, it's a missed opportunity that they were not able to do that. So those are a few examples. And I think, yeah, it's a matter of realigning your perspective, but it's also providing the platform where these conversations can happen. Because states often have this um, mentality that we have the mandate and we should perform this function in society.
Well, very relevant. I think a lot of what you're sharing is super relevant to the conversations happening, at least in different teams and country offices around the region here now. As we're looking to mobilize ways in which to imagine post-COVID, a more building forward, if you will, not just building back better. So I'm going to pop over, and I see we have a few different things. Just wanted to point out, actually next Wednesday, there is a dialogue happening in the Philippines specific to grassroots innovation, looking at it both from an opportunity from an upstream at a policy perspective, but also bringing in some examples from around the region where grassroots innovation is being taken quite seriously and mainstreaming in different ways. Although I could never argue it's fully mainstream whatsoever, but we're at least interesting having that dialogue. So there's the link in the chat box for those that are keen to follow that discussion. And then also here, so two threads. And you can answer, of course, in any format you want. But one was just a curious question around how is AltDev working with other community-based networks? So is there, and there's a, networks of networks, right? So there's so many different things happening. So just curious how you are strategically aligning or organizing or collecting. Are you push or you pull? I think that would be interesting to hear mechanically what that looks like for you within the ecosystem, particularly, I guess, the Philippines. And then also, one of our colleagues in Nepal is curious to know, and I'm just going to read it verbatim a bit so that I don't misinterpret what he's sharing here. But to your question, it says, I understand that as per your experience, you've seen corporation invasion and grassroots communities don't really entertain donor support. I wanted to know that what if development partners like UNDP and others would want to support alternative practitioners that you have mentioned in terms of scaling their practices or social enterprises and community programs? Would they be open to, or are they hesitant to this? So what is the perception on the other side of, let's say, larger intermediaries that would maybe want to be more supportive? Is it open arms? Is it not? I imagine there's probably a lot of ways to, depending, right? But if you had any kind of sense of that, that would be interesting to hear as well.
Yeah. Let me answer Bisam's question first. I think it's really um, the responses are diverse. So, for example, I was talking about I told you about Pastor Benny, and Pastor Ben is quite reluctant with external donors because the experience of indigenous people in the Philippines have been one of exploitation. So it's either they are exploited because of their stories or their experiences, or they are put into disadvantaged positions. Um, so in that sense, they assume a position of not really distrust, but they are very critical of any person who or group that might say that they are willing to help them. So uh, they would have they would have to see a proof of concept, so to speak, or yeah, and show demonstration of sincerity because of the yun nga, the past experiences that were not so good. But on the other hand, you also have, for example, the social enterprises on women. This organization was born out of the organizing work of an NGO, and so they are very used, or at least before they were very used to subsidies. And but later on in their life, where they or their organizational life, where they realized that their sewing business wouldn't be sustainable if they keep on uh, relying on external funds. And so that's the time that they became reluctant in a sense, because uh, they want to be self-sufficient first. Um, so it's a different mixture of attitudes, and I wouldn't be able to generalize. And I think the way to approach it is the best way to approach it, if people or groups are reluctant, is um to immerse oneself first in their situation and understand where they are coming from if there's resistance. In the Philippines, or at least in the community development jargon in the Philippines, we call it community integration. You integrate yourself in the community first, and build relationships, and build trust. Uh, and Yun. So to answer the second question about whether AltDev is working through networks, um, we've been engaging the uh, ACSC APF, ASEAN Civil Society. Sorry, I forgot what ACSC and APF means. But it's a formation of civil society organizations parallel to the ASEAN. And so the way we approach ACSC APF is to forward a, re- a reframing of how do we engage the ASEAN mechanism itself. Because for the longest time, we've been engaging the ASEAN mechanism. So we've been saying that actually your ideas are not people centered. You're putting profits over people, and ASEAN member states or the secretariat would simply shrug it off uh, in in various ways. And so in this network, we are arguing that perhaps we should go back to uh, we should go back to the basics and go back to the grassroots instead, and then try to organize from there, and try to reimagine a different form of regionalism, one that is people led instead of being reactive to the actions of the state or states in the ASEAN region. So that's my answer.
All right. So just on that note, I know we have a few minutes left, so I wanted to kind of expand on that thread you were just sharing around, collaborating with the ASEAN Secretariat. And are you noticing, well, certainly what you're sharing today is not everyday discussion, it's not quite there in terms of the mainstream. And you're talking about challenging a status quo. In effect, but at the end of the day, it's about collaboration as well. So curious to know how some of those, if you have inroads around shaping, or let's say, helping to facilitate the evolution of the mechanism of, say, the structure such as ASEAN, for example, the bureaucracy around that, and how might some of those conversations be going, if they are going at all. And this is just, I think, a curious question that a lot of us from different points of view in different institutions are asking ourselves. It's sometimes it feels like the machine is there, and how do you even begin to re-engineer a machine that everyone's looking at, seemingly with impossible task of shifting. So do you have hope? Is it about making inroads? Have those inroads already been started? In what ways do you champion this kind of work in tandem with what exists, which by default has a lot of power as well?
You saved the most difficult question for last. It's actually very difficult because there's a temptation to abandon the system entirely because it hasn't really brought um, tangible benefits to ASEAN people. Um, and that's why one of the and that's one of the offshoots, or one of the consequences of why we have this alternative development and arguing for a people-centered form of regionalism, is because we don't believe in the system. We don't necessarily believe in the system itself, but nonetheless, we think that it is a monster that you need to contend with, and so we continue to participate in say ACSC, APF, in order to um, push the agenda of first reframing the orientation of the entire network back to the grassroots, and at the same time maintain the criticality of it against the so-called machine. Um, and so I think broadly, I think that's at least for AltDev. I think that's the true two-pronged approach that we have adopted in dealing with ASEAN.
Short and sweet. Okay. Oh, Carl, I know we only have just a few minutes, and I really enjoyed even just having the conversations that led up to this eventual virtual session we're having, and in going through some of the publications. For those of you that may not have had the chance to check it out yet, there are published collections of stories and essays and work that the center has been literally publishing and convening. So that does exist online, and we will do our best to also make sure that that's on the website. That's part of the EDGE track as well for others to dig into. But what might be some of the last kind of provocations you would like to leave with us? So the sticky thing that would be, let's say for this audience, especially quite a lot of UNDP people, but also it's open to externals too. But what's maybe one of the key messages that in closing would be a helpful one for us to consider, taking with us as we wrap up the session today?
Yeah, I think one of the key points that I'm trying to make draws from an assertion that in the process of um, achieving development, development is either brokered, translated, appropriated, and it's different. There are different translations of it, and so, but nonetheless, people or various actors occupy various positions of power and privilege. And so when we try, or we as managers, or you as managers of development, try to uh, promote people's development, maybe it's just, maybe it's good to ask once in a while, whose vision, whose stories do I carry, whose narratives do I carry, and whose visions do I wish to come to fruition. And I think that is an important point, a reflexive point for us development workers, in order to sustain ourselves in this kind of work. So the questioning, self-questioning is an entirely good thing for us, because not many people, or at least those who are in power, not many people are doing it, and they just roll out development on people's behalf without thinking about the consequences. And so I leave you with our stories, the people stories, who I populated with I hopefully with some detail, at least to make them human, and so that people will be reminded that these people exist and their stories matter. So I think that's it.
Thank you so much. And if anybody would like to get in touch with Carl, feel free to let us know if you don't already have an inroad to the contact. Happy to continue these conversations. It's a really important line on our agenda, particularly as we look at it, let's say the banner of inclusive innovation, as we're coming at this from hosted by the innovation team here. But I really appreciate you kind of reinforcing the notion of strengthening the capability and the lens, the mindsets of how we approach a people-centric or human-centric, story for development. And I think that reminder could never be said enough. So a big thank you, and thanks to those that were sharing some resources in the chat box. Terrence, I see you're adding a lot more here too. So really appreciate the dialogue and the conversation, and also hope that others, if you're interested, join next Wednesday, the Philippines team that's going to be hosting a dialogue on specifically inclusive innovation, the many facets that covers too. So with many thanks to you and the team, and Carl, we'll be looking forward to continuing our conversations. So have a great rest of your day, wherever, for everyone, and Carl, you over there in Quezon City, yeah, QC. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.